That's right. We're talking about macro videography in this video, and specifically how I got these shots. I often call these shots B-roll. But what is B-roll? I'll put it as simply as possible. What you're seeing now is the A camera. This is my talking head section. What you're seeing now is B-roll. B-roll is just footage that we overlay on top of the talking head video to make the video more interesting, such as if I pick up the G Master lens here, then I would show you B-roll of that lens as I'm talking about it. B-roll is also very important. You can use it to disguise any mistakes you've made in the video. You can also use it to disguise any jump cuts. If I didn't use B-roll or zoom in like I am now, this is what the footage would look like. This footage has now been edited and I've cut out my breathing and any of the spaces that I've done, and any of the pausing that I've done I have cut out of this piece of video. And you can see how horrible it is. If you haven't got access to B-roll, you can cut in and out. This is what I'm doing now. I'm cutting in and out depending on where I'm cutting the footage. That way it disguises the jump cuts, but the best way to do it is with B-roll. So again, I could talk about my lens, I will show a lens, or if I'm talking about ants, I can show some footage of ants, and it's far less jarring to the viewer. When it comes to macro photography here on this channel, I often say gear doesn't matter. In fact, I've even got some videos where I take some old gear out and I do some macro photography on that gear. However, when it comes to video, gear absolutely matters. So my camera of choice for this year is the Sony ZV-E1. Now currently it's filming me right now, so I can't show it to you here now, but here's some nice B-roll shots of the camera for you. This Sony camera is an absolute beast when it comes to video. It's a full frame camera. I'll get into the specs of the camera in just a minute and why they're important to macro video, but what I want to do is talk about the key feature of those shots, and that's the lens, and that is this bad boy here. This is the Sony 90mm macro lens. It is the FE 2.8 90mm macro GOSS. It's a G Master lens. This combined with the Sony ZV-E1 is an absolute monster for doing macro videography, and believe it or not, all those shots are handheld. There are certain things you want to look at on a camera's specs if you want to do macro video, but the most important one is the frames per second, the video's frame rate. On the Sony, I'm getting a 4K 120 frames a second, and the frame rate is very important because we're able to slow down the footage in post afterwards. The two main factors of why we want a high frame rate is this. First of all, you get nice stability, so any little micro shakes disappear when you slow down the footage. Take a look at this footage here. This is at a frame rate of 24 frames a second, and now this is shot at 120 frames a second but slowed down to a 24p timeline. You can see how those micro stutters and jitters are smoothed out, and it's nice and smooth. Another factor as well when it comes to macro videography or filming any type of B-roll is when you film at 120 frames a second, that gives you 5 seconds of footage for every second you film. So if I film an ant for 1 second, I can get 5 seconds of footage out of it once it's slowed down. There are other contributing factors as to what you want to look at when it comes to the video side of things. The resolution. You want the highest resolution possible. It's not just for the sharpness and clarity, but you can also punch in a little bit to get that extra precise magnification, exactly the same as you would get if you started using a crop sensor over a full frame camera. So I can recompose the shot or just to get a boost in magnification. This camera also films in 10-bit 422. This is the amount of colors that's in the footage. As you can see here from this chart here, 10-bit offers far more colors than an 8-bit camera can, which means we have more leeway when we want to edit the footage in post afterwards. Another key factor of this combination of camera and lens is stability. We have image stabilization in the lens and in the camera. Now, unfortunately, we can't use the full stabilization, which on this camera is called active dynamic stabilization, but the stabilization we get is very good. The Sony also has a bit of an advantage over other cameras I've used. It's got an S and Q mode. When we switch the camera over to S and Q, we're able to tell the camera what frame rate we want to record in and what frame rate we will be editing in. The footage is already slowed down for me, and all I got to do is drag it onto the timeline, and that is absolutely fantastic. It means we can quickly switch from a standard talking head shot, which is what you're seeing here now, quickly switch to S&Q and get some nice smooth B-roll footage. One thing to note though, when you are using the S&Q mode on this Sony camera, is it doesn't record audio. One of the magic things that the Sony ZV-E1 does is dual native ISO. Native ISO means it's an ISO setting that is the cleanest on the camera. For normal talking head video like this now, I am using an ISO of 640. But unlike other cameras I've used in the past, this Sony has a dual native ISO, which means there's another ISO setting that is very, very clean. And this ISO is 12,800. So when it comes to the macro video side of things, we want to turn up our ISO to 12,800, which gives us very clean footage. But at the same time, we can now also stop down our aperture to a higher aperture like an f10 or f11, which gives us more depth of field and a correct exposure. Unlike in photography, when you're doing video, your shutter speed is locked off at a certain speed. In video, it's double the number that you are using for your frame rate. So if you're filming at a 25 frames per second, your shutter needs to be 1/50th. So when we're doing B1, we are recording at 120 frames a second. We want a shutter speed that is as close as possible to 240. In the Sony's case, this is 250. So we have 250 on our shutter speed, an ISO of 12,800, and then around an f10. This gives us a good exposure. And when it comes to exposing, I do use zebras to show when my highlights are blown out. When you're recording in a log format, you don't want to expose for your meter as it would do for photography. In this case, you'd expose it in the middle, which is 0. Different cameras have different exposure needs for their log footage. For this particular camera, I need to expose to 1.5 to 1.7 stops overexposed to get the correct exposure. I know it sounds mad because we are recording in log, and that's just the way these cameras work. And you can use neutral density filters to help you get that correct exposure. But in the case of macro video, you want as much depth of field as possible, so I'll just close down that aperture to get the correct exposure. When it comes to focusing for my B-roll shots of ants, what I will typically do is I will set the lens to the magnification I want. In this case, it's 1:1, and I will use a manual focus. Now, I have tried the insect autofocus on the Sony camera, and if you're using a wide angle lens, it does work pretty well. I filmed some shots of my spiders with that autofocus. When it comes to the actual 1:1 macro on this macro lens, then it doesn't quite work as well. So you are best switching it to a manual and focusing yourself. I'm talking about focusing, just like I teach in macro photography, this Sony camera also has focus peaking. So what we do is we turn on the focus peaking. In this case, I've set it to red. And then all I've got to do is position myself in such a way I can move the camera backwards and forwards until the subject starts to show the focus peaking colors. And then I'll just start recording. Typically, I'm already recording when I'm moving the camera because, again, I've only got to get a second or two of the insect in focus to get a nice 5 to 10 second section of footage for my videos. Colors in your video are very important, which is why I like to use this Passport video color checker. By showing this to the camera and recording it, we're able to get accurate colors out of our footage. And with DaVinci Resolve, I can also create a LUT for my Sony camera that I can just slap straight onto the B-roll, and it works every single time. Accurate colors is very, very important. Once we've got accurate colors, we can then add a LUT on top to create a creative look. If we want it looking like it's sunset, or if it's early morning, we can do that look once we've got accurate colors. So since I'm recording with the Sony now, I can't share the Sony, so I'm going to use my Canon and a substitute camera. There's no magic thing going on here. I'm not using any tripods. It's simply the power of that camera. Combining the high frame rate with the 4K and the image stabilization, I'm able to hand hold my camera just like I would if I was doing the photography side of stuff. Knowing your subject as well really helps to get the shot you want. Knowing if they're going to fly away or not is really good knowing, because getting that fly away shot is also interesting because, again, you're slowing it down. You're seeing the wings beat on a butterfly or a moth as it flies away. When it comes to ants, if they're going up and down a stalk, you can follow them up and down. And again, you only need a few seconds of footage for you to get a decent amount of footage for you to edit with. Again, 120 frames a second on a 24p timeline is 1 to 5. So 1 second of recorded footage is 5 seconds of edited footage. I'm talking about editing. What do we do once we've filmed our subjects? That's simple. We take it into DaVinci Resolve. If you're using any other camera, you may need to right click on your footage, tell it to use the same frames per second as what your timeline is. I'm using a 23.976 timeline, and then that footage is nice and slowed down. I will then zoom in just a little bit. I'll go into the coloring section and I'll put on the saved LUT that I've used for my Sony camera. Once that's been done, if you're still a little bit unsteady with the camera, we can also stabilize it within DaVinci. We go to the stabilization section and just click on stabilization, and that gives us some very nice B-roll footage for our videos. So the footage you're seeing now is shot on the Sony ZV-E1 with the 90mm macro handheld. We are at 4K 120 frames a second, a shutter speed of 250, ISO 12800 and around an f10 to f14 depending on whether your subject is in the sunlight or not. I will sometimes block the sunlight so that it's more neutral. That way I'm getting a better exposure, because this camera is so good in low light that sometimes you've got too much light. And with those settings, I am able to do handheld macro video at a 1:1 magnification. Previously to having the Sony camera, I would use my iPhone for doing B-roll. If you come into your iPhone, there is a section called slow-mo, and in there you can film slow motion. Now on the iPhone, it's 1080p, but it does do 240 frames a second. And it also records the audio as well, which is an added benefit if you're going to be using your iPhone. Now, some phones can't do macro out of the box, and they might need a little help, which is why we use a clip-on lens like this. This is the reflex lens. This is the 10x long-range macro. We put that onto our iPhone, set it to a slow motion, and just start recording. And you take that footage and you slow it down in your editing software afterwards. All the years previous to 2024, all the B-roll of the insects has been shot using my iPhone, and it does a fabulous job. But it's nowhere near as good as the Sony ZV-E1 paired with the 90mm macro lens. That combination is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to be doing a lot more macro videography on this channel, so give it a thumbs up if you're looking forward to that. Have you got any questions about macro videography? Leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them, but that's where I shall leave for this video. My name is Stewart Wood. I thank you for getting to the end of this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you for sticking to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, then please subscribe and click the like button. It really does help out the channel. I want to thank my Patreon supporters for their continued support in supporting me and this channel. If you're interested in joining Patreon, then check in the description below this video for a link to Patreon. If you want to continue watching my macro journey, then click one of the videos in front of you now.